they'll have a greenish hue tinge present in the upper bulbar conjunctiva. And intermittent jaundice is when the patient develops jaundice during intermittent periods. So, for example, in hemolytic jaundice, during the acute event, they'll be having jaundice, and once the hemolysis crisis subsides, the jaundice will wane off. So next, coming to the differential diagnosis. So differential diagnosis, where else can you see yellowish discoloration? Is you can see it in hypercaroteninemia. So the foods which are keratin rich contain vegetables, for example, when you take excess of carrot and all that, you can have yellowish discoloration again. But then the characteristic feature is that in hypercaroteninemia, so how will you differentiate between your hypercaroteninemia and jaundice is that hypercaroteninemia will generally spare the sclera as well as the conjunctiva. So by that way you can differentiate. And apart from that, in jaundice it is going to be diffuse, whereas in hypercaroteninemia it is going to be patchy involvement. And other conditions which can mimic is your hypothyroid. In hypothyroid, again, if you see, whenever you take excess of keratin, all the metabolism also will be delayed. So hypothyroid patients, again, they are susceptible to develop hyperkeratinemia, and again this can be a differential diagnosis for jaundice. And apart from that, drugs like quinacrine and phenol. So this quinacrine was once used for malaria. So these drugs, again, they can result in yellowish discoloration. So next, coming to few of causes of jaundice. So respiratory system and jaundice, you can think of antitubercular treatment. If the patient is on antitubercular drugs, so you know that the first line ATT drugs will be your HRSD, rifampicin, isoniazid, your pyrazinamide, and ethambutol. So among this, if you see, if suppose if the patient among this, if all your HR as well as Z, all these three are hepatotoxic drugs. So the patient, you'll have to monitor serially the LFT of these patients, and if not properly monitored, this can result in jaundice. So and apart from that, you can also think of bronchogenic carcinoma with liver metastasis, and this can again result in jaundice. And in cor pulmonare is right when the patient develops right heart failure secondary to lung pathology. So in such cases, again, if you see, there will be backflow of blood and there will be congestion in the liver, and this liver congestion can again result in manifestation as jaundice. And alpha 1 antitrypsin deficiency. So alpha 1 antitrypsin deficiency is a disease that will affect both the lung as well as your liver. In the lung, it can result in emphysema, and in the liver, it can result in liver cirrhosis, and thereby the patient can develop jaundice. And next, coming to serious causes of jaundice. So serious causes of jaundice, you can see it in congestive cardiac failure. So in congestive cardiac failure, again, it is because of congestive hepatomegaly that you will develop jaundice. And in infective endocarditis, again, you can have jaundice. So in infective endocarditis, you can have hemolysis, you can have anemia, you can have jaundice, you can have splenomegaly, and other features like rod spot, Osler's node. All these you can see in infective endocarditis. And apart from that, in prosthetic heart valves, so prosthetic heart valves, if you see, this can result in RBC hemolysis, and hemolysis again can result in more formation of more release of your bilirubin and all that, and this can again result in jaundice. And apart from that, certain drugs can also cause jaundice. For example, your amiodarone, again, it is a hepatotoxic drug, and this can result in jaundice. Amiodarone is especially used an antiarrhythmic, which is mainly used as an antiarrhythmic drug. So next, coming to the causes of jaundice. So next, coming to okay, so jaundice can be either prehepatic jaundice, or it can be due to intrahepatic jaundice, or it could be a posthepatic jaundice. So prehepatic jaundice, if you see, it's mainly because of hemolysis, you'll get prehepatic jaundice. And intrahepatic jaundice, the most common cause is going to be viral hepatitis. And posthepatic jaundice, the most common cause is going to be your obstructive jaundice. So let's see about the metabolism of bilirubin. So first, what happens is in the reticuloendothelial cells, what will happen when the RBCs are broken down? Or this macrophages will phagocytose all the senescent RBCs, and they will release the pigment hemoglobin. Right? Then hemoglobin will be degraded down into heme and globin. So what will happen to the heme part? The globin part, if you see, will enter into the amino acid pool. Whereas what will happen to the heme part, if you see, will be converted by the enzyme heme oxygenase into biliverdin. And then this biliverdin will be converted by the enzyme bilirubin reductase into bilirubin. And this bilirubin, if you see, it is So this bilirubin is actually your unconjugated form of bilirubin, right? So this bilirubin is insoluble in water. So it will combine with your albumin and it will get transported to your liver. And once when it enters into the liver, the albumin will enter into the circulation and the bilirubin will be taken into the liver. And once inside the liver, it will be converted by the enzyme UGT glucuronide. It will be conjugated by the enzyme glucuronyl transferase 1, which is present in the endoplasmic reticulum, that is located in chromosome number 2. It will be conjugated to bilirubin monoglucuronide. And once bilirubin monoglucuronide is formed, it will be converted again, it will be again conjugated by UGT1A1 into bilirubin diglucuronide. And once this bilirubin diglucuronide, if you see, this is actually a conjugated form, and this conjugated form is water soluble. So this, if you see, will then be excreted into the bile via the transporter protein MRP2, which is nothing but your multi-drug resistance protein 2, which will be located in the chromosome number 10. And once this bilirubin diglucuronide enters into the bile, then it will be taken into the intestine. And in the intestine, what happens is that all the conjugated bilirubin you see, right, this conjugated bilirubin will be deconjugated by the bacteria that is present, will be converted by the bacteria that is present into urobilinogen. And 80% of the urobilinogen, if you see, will be converted into stercobilinogen, and the stercobilinogen will be excreted into the stools. Whereas the remaining 20% of the urobilinogen, if you see, it will enter via the enterohepatic circulation into the portal blood, and then it will again reach into the liver. And from there, if you see, it will be then again taken to kidney, and this urobilinogen, if you see, will be finally excreted in the urine. So, what happens in obstructive jaundice? In obstructive jaundice, if you see, you'll be having, for example, in cholestatic jaundice, you'll be having obstruction at the level of the biliary canaliculi. So, once you have an obstruction at the level of biliary canaliculi, so what will happen is that, so this you can see the last form of your conjugated bilirubin. So, your conjugated bilirubin levels are going to be elevated. Whereas what will happen, so since there is going to be obstruction at the level of the bilirubin, there will be no stercobilinogen that is formed, or there will be no urobilinogen that is formed. And hence, because of this reason, if you see in obstructive jaundice, your conjugated bilirubin levels will be high, and your stercobilinogen and urobilinogen levels are going to be absent in the stool as well as in the urine. So, then next in hemolytic jaundice. So in prehepatic jaundice, for example, in hemolytic jaundice, what happens is that there will be excess of hemolysis, and because of and there will be release of more and more of bilirubin, and all the bilirubin that is and all this bilirubin that is released, if you see, it will be saturated by the enzyme UGT1A1. So once all these enzymes get saturated, what will happen is that the bilirubin that is formed will no longer be able to get conjugated. So in hemolytic jaundice, the unconjugated form of bilirubin levels are going to raise. Whereas in your intrahepatic cause, for example, in your viral hepatitis, what happens is that there will be elevation of both conjugated bilirubin as well as your unconjugated bilirubin. So when will you call it as unconjugated bilirubin hyperbilirubinemia? When the indirect bilirubin fraction is more than 80%, then you'll call it as unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia. So mainly unconjugated bilirubinemia will be because of increased production. So increased production as in hemolysis, or it could be because of decreased hepatic uptake. So again, if you see, whenever you have decreased hepatic uptake, conjugation will not be possible by the enzyme UGT1A1. So, and again, if you see, your unconjugated bilirubin or the indirect bilirubin fraction is going to be elevated. So there are drugs that will inhibit that will decrease your hepatic uptake of bilirubin, and these drugs are your rifampicin as well as your probenecid. And then if you see, it could be because of defective conjugation. Again, your indirect fraction is going to be elevated. So drugs that will result in defective conjugation are your HIV protease inhibitors, atazanavir and indinavir, or it could be due to congenital diseases. For example, in your Crigler-Najjar or your Gilbert syndrome. So Crigler-Najjar is because of a defect in your UGT1A1 enzyme. So again, because of which you will be having indirect bilirubin fraction or the unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia will be present. Next, coming to conjugated hyperbilirubinemia. So, when will you call it as conjugated hyperbilirubinemia? Is when your direct bilirubin fraction is going to be more than 50%, then you'll call it as conjugated hyperbilirubinemia. So, one of the most common causes is going to be cholestatic jaundice, and congenital causes. Another are congenital causes. One is your Dubin-Johnson syndrome. So, in Dubin-Johnson syndrome, you're going to have a defect in the MRP2. So, and because of this defect in MRP2, it is again going to behave similar to your obstructive jaundice. Your conjugated bilirubin levels are going to be elevated, and your stercobilinogen as well as urobilinogen are going to be absent. So, another congenital disease is your Rota syndrome, again where you will have conjugated hyperbilirubinemia. So, next coming to the, let's see what happens in prehepatic jaundice. So first, what happens in prehepatic jaundice due to hemolysis? What will happen to the color of the stool? The color of the stool is going to be normal in color. What will happen to the indirect bilirubin levels? Indirect bilirubin levels, as I've already said, since there will be release of more bilirubin and all these enzymes will be saturated, your indirect bilirubin levels are going to be elevated. It is going to be more than 80%, whereas your direct bilirubin levels are going to be normal. So what will happen to the bilirubin that is present in the urine? It is again going to be normal. What will happen to the urinary urobilinogen level? Again, that is also going to be normal. Your liver enzymes will be mostly normal. Next, coming to intrahepatic jaundice. So in intrahepatic jaundice, what happens is that the color of the stool will be variable because you are going to have elevation of both indirect bilirubin as well as a direct, because there will be some component of obstruction also present in viral hepatitis. So what will happen to the indirect bilirubin levels are going to be elevated. Direct bilirubin levels again they are also going to be elevated, and bilirubin in the urine again if you see they are going to be elevated, and because of which the urine if you see will be darker in color. Your urobilinogen will be usually normal, and your liver enzymes, especially in viral hepatitis, they are going to be very high. AST as well as ALT both will be very much elevated. Next, coming to obstructive jaundice. So, obstructive jaundice, what happens is that your stercobilinogen is not going to be formed, right? So, since your stercobilinogen is not formed, what will happen to the color of the stool? The stercobilinogen is responsible for the yellow color of the stool. So, since there is no stercobilinogen formed, the color of the stool is going to be clay color. And what will happen to the indirect bilirubin levels are going to be normal. What will happen to the direct bilirubin level? Direct bilirubin level is going to be elevated. And what will happen to the bilirubin in the urine? So bilirubin in the urine, if you see, we have seen that the conjugated bilirubin levels are going to be very much elevated, right? And these conjugated bilirubins are the ones that are soluble. So there will be excess of bilirubin in the urine. But then what will happen to the urinary urobilinogen? Urobilinogen is going to be absent. Why? Because there is no conversion of your conjugated bilirubin into stercobilinogen, and urobilinogen conversion is not possible because of the obstruction, and because of which your urinary urobilinogen levels are going to be absent. And liver enzymes, if you see, because of obstruction, your ALP levels will be elevated generally in case of your post-hepatic obstructive jaundice. So next, let's see about pedal edema. So what is edema? Edema is nothing but excess of interstitial fluid, and once it becomes clinically evident, then we'll call it as edema. So development of edema. So edema, if you see, can be either because of increase in the intracapillary hydrostatic pressure. So either the capillary hydrostatic pressure increases, what will happen is that the fluid will leak out into the interstitial compartment, and this can result in edema. Or it could be because of reduction in the oncotic pressure. So generally what happens is that all the albumin and all the proteins that are present, especially the albumin, they will tend to draw water around them, and they will tend to keep all the fluid within the intravascular compartment. So what happens whenever you have a reduction in the oncotic pressure? So whenever you have a reduction in the oncotic pressure, if you see, again the water will tend to, the fluid will tend to accumulate in the interstitial space. Or it could be because of inadequate lymphatic drainage. So lymphatic system, what does it does is, again lymphatic, one of the main function of the lymphatics is to absorb all the fluid from the interstitium into the lymphatics, and then again bring it back to the circulation. So whenever you have again lymphatic an obstruction that is involving the lymphatics, again all the fluid that is going to accumulate in the interstitial space is going to be elevated. So again inadequate lymphatic drainage can again result in edema, or it could be because of damage to the capillary endothelial barrier. So capillary endothelial barrier, if you see, generally it is going to be a tight junction that will not and because of this tight junction, uh, as you can see that there will be usually no release of all these fluid or all the protein compartments. There will be no leak of all these fluid as well as protein compartment from the intravascular to the interstitial space. But then what will happen if suppose if you have any sort of infection or inflammation, this can result in damage to the capillary endothelium. And once the capillary endothelium is damaged, what happens is that there will be leak of all the fluid as well as proteins from the intravascular compartment into the interstitial compartment, and again this can result in the development of edema. The development of edema is mainly because of these four reasons. Either it could be because of increase in capillary hydrostatic pressure, or it could be because of reduced oncotic pressure, as in hypoalbuminemia. Whenever you have albumin content reduced, like your hypoproteinemia, or it could be because of inadequate lymphatic drainage, for example lymphatic obstruction, or it could be due to damage to the capillary endothelial barrier. So how do you check for edema? Is you'll have to apply firm pressure just above the medial malleolus for 30 seconds, and then you look if the patient has got edema, if it pits or if it doesn't pit. So when will you call it as pitting edema? If there is indentation, then you will call it as pitting edema. So apart from that, we also have fast edema and slow edema. So what is fast edema? Is when you release the pressure. So once after 30 seconds, when you release the pressure, if the edema resolves within 40 seconds, then you will call it as fast edema, and the cause is hypoalbuminemia. So whereas what is slow edema? If the once you release the pressure from the medial malleolus, and if the edema, if the pitted edema, if the pitting lasts for more than 1 minute, then you will call it as slow edema. And example is going to be a congestive cardiac failure. So next, coming to levels of edema. So if suppose if the edema extends only up to the ankle, then you will grade it as 1 plus. If the edema extends up to the shin, then you will grade it as 2 plus. If there is edema that is extending up to the knee, then you will grade it as 3 plus. And the edema, if it extends up to the thigh, then you will grade it as 4 plus. So up to the ankle it is 1 plus, shin is 2 plus, knee is 3 plus, and up to the thigh it is going to be 4 plus. So this is again grading of edema. So next, coming to the causes of edema. So edema, if you see, can be either due to generalized edema, or it could be a localized edema. So let's first see about generalized edema. So the causes of generalized edema are going to be a cardiac failure or a renal failure, a hepatic cirrhosis, hypoalbuminemia or hypoproteinemia. Whenever your protein level is going to be less than 3 gram per deciliter, or it could be drug-induced edema, or it could be nutritional edema. So first, coming to cardiac failure. So cardiac failure, again, if you see, your heart is not going to pump properly. There will be increase in the hydrostatic pressure, and this increase in hydrostatic pressure, if you see, will result in fluid accumulation in the interstitial space, and this can result in edema. So what is the distinguishing feature of edema and cardiac failure? So edema and cardiac failure, if you see, it is predominantly going to be a dependent edema. So what is dependent edema? If suppose if the patient sits for a long time, if the patient is in a sitting posture for a long time, then the fluid, if you see, will tend to get accumulated in the dependent region, which is nothing but your lower limb. Whereas if you see, if the patient is bedridden, and if they have been prolonged, and if the patient has been following prolonged bed rest and all, what will happen is that your sacral region will be the dependent region, right? So in such cases, if you see, in such patients, you'll have to look at the sacral region for the presence of edema. So cardiac failure, it will be mainly a dependent edema. Next, coming to renal failure. So renal failure, what happens is that in renal failure, if you see, the fluid, that the excess of interstitial fluid, if you see, will mainly tend to get located around the orbit. So they'll be mainly having periorbital edema. So why do they have, because of periorbital edema, how will their face look? The face will be usually puffy. They will have facial puffiness will be present, decreased urine output will be present. So why do they have characteristically periorbital edema is because there will be more of collagen and elastic tissue in that region. Loose connective tissue is going to be more surrounding the eye, and because of this your renal failure, if you see, periorbital edema will be very characteristic. Next, coming to your hepatic cirrhosis. So what happens in hepatic cirrhosis? In hepatic cirrhosis, again, if you see, because of excessive renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, because of excessive splanchnic vasodilatation, again, if you see, there will be accumulation of the fluid in the form of ascites. So hepatic cirrhosis, it is mainly because of splanchnic vasodilatation, and apart from that, portal hypertension. So both these together, what they will do, what this can result is, this can result in excess of fluid accumulation in the peritoneal cavity, and this can result in the formation of ascites. So generally, if you see cardiac failure patients, they'll present with first edema involving the lower limb or the sacral region. Your renal failure patient, they will present with edema that is first involving the periorbital region or facial puffiness. And your hepatic cirrhosis patient, how they will present is, they'll present with first edema in the abdominal cavity. So they will first present with ascites. Next is your hypoalbuminemia. So hypoalbuminemia is again, for example, in kwashiorkor, when the protein levels are going to be less than 3 gram per deciliter. Again, in such cases, again, if you see, you are going to develop generalized edema, or it could be drug-induced edema. So, for example, certain vasodilator drugs like your nifedipine, amlodipine, all these drugs, again, if you see, they can again result in edema. And nutritional edema is something like your hypoalbuminemia. And apart from that, in conditions like your vitamin deficiency, for example, in thiamine deficiency, you can develop wet beriberi. And again, in such conditions, if you see, you can develop generalized edema. Next, coming to localized edema, causes of localized edema. So, localized edema mainly will be either because of infection, or it will be because of lymphatic obstruction, or it could be because of venous obstruction. So, venous obstruction, for example, if the patient has uh, okay, so venous obstruction is example, if the patient has DVT, they'll be having localized edema. Okay, so DVT, how it will present? It will usually present following prolonged bed rest or following prolonged immobilization. This can result in venous thrombosis, and because of venous thrombosis, the patient will have unilateral edema that is involving the side of your the venous thrombosis. And apart from that, you will also have pain, severe pain will be present in case of DVT. And apart, okay, so this is one. And lymphedema, if you see, generally your lymphatic obstruction will be initially unilateral. So following a filariasis, but filariasis you can also get bilateral edema. Um, and then resection of lymph nodes for for certain carcinomas. For example, for breast carcinoma, following resection of all the axillary nodes, the patient can develop edema that is involving the upper limb, or following radiation therapy. So radiation therapy is again similar to your destruction of lymph nodes, and this can again result in localized edema that is involving the involved region. Next is inflammatory edema. For example, following infections and inflammation, if you see, there will be more of capillary permeability, and there will be damage to all these capillary endothelium. There will be more, the capillary permeability will be increased, and because of which the patient can develop cellulitis. So cellulitis is again going to be a localized edema. And apart from that, if you see trauma, for example, fracture that is involving a localized region, again that can result in edema of that region. And prolonged immobility. For example, in hemiparesis, in CVA patients and all, in cerebrovascular patients, following prolonged immobilization, what will happen is that all the compression by the muscular compression that will result in your venous emptying, everything will be lost. And because of this, if you see, the patient will tend to have a localized edema that is going to be present in the involved region. So next, coming to other causes of edema. So apart from that, if you see, you can have edema in hypothyroid as well as in hyperthyroid also, you can have edema. Hyperthyroid, especially in your Graves disease, you can have edema, and in hypothyroid patients you can have edema. So what happens in hypothyroid patient? In hypothyroid patients, there is going to be deposition of hyaluronic acid, and this hyaluronic acid, if you see, this will tend to attract all the in the interstitial space. All these hyaluronic acid will get deposited, and this hyaluronic acid, if you see, it will get deposited in the extracellular matrix, and it will tend to accumulate water. It will tend to draw water. It is a glycosaminoglycan that will tend to absorb water towards it, and it will tend to draw water towards it, and this can result in your edema. So in the edema, so in hypothyroid severe form is known as your mixed edema coma, right? So the edema that you get in mixed edema is generally going to be a non-pitting edema. And apart from that, in Graves' disease, the edema that you get is known as pre-tibial mixed edema. So why do you get pre-tibial mixed edema? It is because it will be mainly located in the region of shin. So what happens is that in Graves' disease, there will be stimulation of all the dermal fibroblasts by the thyroid stimulating hormone that are antibody. And because of this proliferation of all these fibroblasts, again, if you see, the patient can develop edema. And other causes, it could be because of hyperadrenocortism, for example, following excess of glucosteroid use, or in Cushing syndrome. Again, if you see, the patient can have edema and drugs. So drugs causing edema, some of the most important drugs are your NSAIDs. Your NSAIDs can cause edema, or your vasodilators, especially your most of the patients will be on nifedipine. So calcium channel antagonist, especially your nifedipine, can cause edema, and your steroids can cause edema, and estrogen can cause edema. Um, so sometimes, if you see in women, they can have cyclical edema during the around the menstrual time, because of excess of estrogen. If you see, these patients, they can have edema. So causes of non-pitting edema, your mixed edema will be generally a non-pitting edema. Your lymphedema, again, if you see, because of all these excess proliferation of all the fibroblast, again, and all, if you see in lymphedema also, it will be generally non-pitting. And angioneurotic edema. So angioneurotic edema is when you develop an anaphylactic reaction, you can have angioedema. So it is because of so angioedema is because of any urticaria or any hypersensitivity reaction. This can result in rapid swelling, especially involving the face. It will be there will be edema which is mainly involving the dermis and the subcutaneous tissue, especially the mucosa as well as the submucosal region. So angioedema will typically affect the face of the individual. So they'll tend to have fluid accumulation, especially around the orbits as well as around the uh, perioral region. So next, coming to few of the rare causes of edema. So there is one disease where you can have congenital absence of the entire leg lymphatics, and this disease is known as the Milroy's disease. So in this disease, again, you see, you can have edema where the child from the birth will have edema present, and whenever you have only edema that is involving the face, you'll also have to think about SVC syndrome. So whenever you have SVC obstruction, what will happen? All the venous drainage of the face is going to be affected, and the patient can have edema involving the face as well as the upper limb. So in SVC obstruction, again, you'll have edema that is going to predominantly involve the upper part of the upper region, the upper limb, as well as your face. And what is going to be the okay? So how will you monitor the treatment? Is one of the most reliable index to assess the treatment in case of edema will be measuring daily the body weight, and then you'll have to look if the edema resolves or. Thank you. Any doubts?